Bonsoir à toutes et à tous et merci d'être présents pour cette
Good
10e
afternoon to
édition
all of you. Thank
du
you for being
regard sur le
present
mal logement
now
en Europe,
during this
co-publié
launch
par
of this
la
10th
Fondation pour le
overview
logement des
of housing
défavorisés
exclusion,
et la
co-published by
FEANTSA.
the Fondation pour le Logement
Je
and
propose qu'on
FEANTSA.
commence cette
We'll start
présentation
right away
notamment avec une introduction
with a few
de
words of
Manuel,
introduction by Manuel
directeur des
Domergue,
études à la Fondation pour le
Research
logement.
Director for the Fondation pour le Logement.
Merci Sarah.
Thank you,
Bonjour à toutes
Sarah,
et à tous.
and good
J'espère
afternoon to all of you. I
que vous
hope
entendez
that
bien.
you can hear me.
Donc je suis directeur des études de la Fondation
I'm
pour le
the
logement des
research
défavorisés,
director for in
anciennement
the
Fondation Abbé
Fondation pour le
Pierre.
Logement des
C'est
Défavorisés,
notre dixième
formerly
regard
Abbé Pierre
sur les
Foundation.
questions de logement.
Today is the launch of our 10th
Publié
report
notre
on
fondation et la
housing
FEANTSA.
exclusion, co-published
Vraiment
by the
un
Foundation
plaisir
and
de travailler
FEANTSA. It's
ensemble.
always a pleasure
C'est aussi
to work
le dixième
together.
anniversaire
It's
d'un
the 10th
partenariat autour de cette
anniversary
association entre
of a
la Fédération
partnership
européenne
between a
des
European
sans-abri
federation
et la
working on
Fondation
homelessness
Baldwin
and a national federation
pour le
such as
logement en
the
général. Donc c'est
Fédération pour le
un regard assez
Logement,
fécond
which is
qui
looking more at
émane
the
de ces
local,
rapports-là.
national
Cette
situation.
session peut vous
Um,
inciter
the
à
reports are
évaluer
quite fruitful
rapidement.
because of
J'ai
this
beaucoup de thèmes
cooperation. And
sur
just look at the
les principaux
previous
indicateurs
reports
qu'on
that
a
we've been
des
looking at,
personnes
mainly
sans-abri,
topics, of course, the question
personnes
of homeless
en
people,
urgence, des personnes qui sont seules dans leur logement, les jeunes,
shelters,
les
people
enfants, les
evicted,
personnes âgées,
youth people, children, elderly
l'immigration,
people, undignified
les
housing,
conditions de vie
consequences
des
of
demandeurs d'asile. On va
COVID,
s'attacher énormément
and the
à ces facettes de la
conditions
crise du logement
are the living
sur le niveau
conditions.
européen
So
et
that's
chercher
main
de manière parfois
that's
évidemment
topics that concern
simplifiée
all the member
à
states
chaque
of the
fois
EU and beyond.
essayer et en
And we've
partie
been
réussir
trying,
à
and in
créer un
part
espace commun
succeeded,
autour de ces
in
logements
creating an
européens, à
open
essayer d'y
discussion
appeler
space
des
on
solutions communes,
housing
à
exclusion
savoir
in Europe
des
and to
différences qui
show
se creusent
common
entre
features
pays, entre régions
or
au sein d'un même
differences
pays. En tout
between
cas, ce rendez-vous
regions
auquel nous
and
assistons
countries. Anyway,
est devenu un rendez-vous
this
qui
report,
intéresse
this launch
les Européens,
that you take part
aussi
in
l'Union
today
européenne et
is
les
something
étrangers,
that interests
puisque
quite a lot the
certains thèmes,
European
certains sujets sont
institutions, the
assez
European Parliament,
tant
for
le
instance.
grand public que
Some
les débats
figures have been
autour du logement en Europe,
widely published
j'allais dire hélas, parce
among
que c'est
the
aussi
grand public,
important, des
and
revenus
alas,
assez
because these are very
sur les
striking
domiciles en
figures with
Europe. C'est des
17
thèmes
millions of
qui
people,
marquent beaucoup, mais heureusement qu'on
homeless
arrive à y
people in
chercher et à
Europe.
montrer, à
But
donner un
it's
visage aussi, parce que c'est
already
souvent
something positive, the fact
face,
that we can
hélas, les débats qui
um,
sont traités en dernier
we,
ou
we, we,
reportés.
we can
18 millions de personnes qui vivent
have
sans logement.
figures.
Là aussi, c'est une
18 million people of
face
living
différente
in badly housed conditions, which is also a
assez
feature
satisfaisant, c'est
of
de voir
housing
que
exclusion. What is
les
quite
institutions
positive is the fact that the
s'emparent
institutions,
de ce
little
sujet,
by little,
les États sont
uh,
exigés aussi
get
par
some
l'Union
ownership
européenne et par
of
la
this
Commission
topic.
européenne
The
pour
states
leur
are
permettre
also
de
challenged
faire
by the
mieux
European
pour le
institutions
logement.
on their
C'est des
results
chantiers qui
concerning the
ont
fight
été
against
lancés notamment
homelessness.
en 2021,
Commitments are
en
taken, the
juin
Lisbon Declaration
avec cette
in
fixette de
2021, the
2030,
strategy to end
on est
homelessness by
très loin aujourd'hui, mais en tout
2030.
cas,
Of course, we are
il y
still
a
far from
une
it.
volonté, il y a l'envie d'échanger,
There is this
d'œuvrer en
willingness
commun, et
to
puis peut-être
exchange
plus
and to work
sur le
together
logement
and to
et
go
sur le
further
logement
in our
de manière
fight against
européenne,
homelessness so that it
fondalisé sur
becomes
des
a
politiques
European policy and not only
vraiment
accumulation of
spécifiques.
national
C'est pour
policies
ça
that
que Ursula von der Leyen,
sometimes interact. That's the
dans
reason
son
why
état de l'Union
von der
précédent, qui
Leyen's
était important,
speech of the Union in
à l'occasion
September
de la
was quite
Commission européenne,
important
les prix du
when
logement ont augmenté de
she
plus de
said that the
20% ces
housing
derniers 10 ans,
prices increased
et puis
by
et
20% for the last
diminuent
10
de
years and
2%
the
dans 5 ans.
permit
Ce n'est pas
to
une simple
build
crise du logement, c'est un
decreased
véritable
also at the
défi
same time. It's not
social
only a
européen.
housing
Évidemment,
crisis,
c'est
it's a
une force dont
social
on a l'habitude
crisis.
d'entendre
These are words that we are not used to listen
présidents
to
de la
hearing
Commission
from
précédents.
European
Et c'est
presidents of
bien
the
pour une raison,
Commission,
car c'est
and
précisément le
all the
thème
more
principal
better
abordé dans ce
because
rapport qui va
it
être
is
présenté
related
cet
to the
après-midi.
topic that of the
L'affordabilité
report that will publish
du
today,
logement
that will be
pour une grande
presented
partie
today,
des
the
Européens.
affordability, or
Évidemment,
rather
c'est un thème
unaffordability of
qui est
housing
aussi
for many
extrêmement
people in the
important
on the continent. This
et
is a
on voit
topic
partout une
that
tendance
is
de dire
more and more
une
relevant
amélioration de
in
la vie
many
moyenne
countries. There is
passe
a
par évidemment la
tendency
taille des logements.
to
On
improve the
sait que les
comfort and
Européens
the
sont de plus en
size
plus petits,
of
mais
the
les logements
housing
sont de
units
qualité haut de gamme, des logements
because
qui ont plus de
housings
20 ans
are in a better
d'existence.
quality
Sauf
today than
que
40,
c'est
50
vrai
years
que
ago,
très
but
cher,
it has a
entre
cost.
les prix des loyers,
It
les
leads
charges,
to rent
les temps de
costs,
remboursement des emprunts immobiliers,
buying,
c'est une charge
purchasing
plus élevée
costs,
et qui
which
a des
are
répercussions
higher and
sur les
higher,
ménages
which
européens
has an
qui passent,
impact
comme le reste
on
des États,
the
sans doute
European
entre 40 et
institutions
50%
when
de
you
vos revenus pour
devote 40% of your income for housing, you don't have money to buy for food, for leisure, and it's a sanction against households because of this unaffordable housing. There will be striking figures given to you this afternoon, even if you take the households that spend more than 45% of their income to house themselves. 8% of the Europeans are in that situation, and 31% of the poorest populations in Europe. So this excessive income share is another indicator that shows different levels of housing exclusion. People make efforts to pay for their housing, and because of that, many people just can't have access to housing anymore, and they are obliged to go to social housing on waiting lists, on very long waiting lists, because the social housing stock is a bit too small. And satisfactory in Europe, in most of the cities in Europe. In the report, there is analysis of the different types of households, single people, people with families, with low income, with low wages, and the major European cities are inaccessible under normal conditions. If you don't want to devote more than 40% of your income, of your wages, of your income to housing. And this report is published at the moment when there is a European topical discussion at European level with a affordable housing plan, which is announced for 26, and the housing commissioner was appointed for this in this new commission. But of course, this means, what do we mean by affordable housing, and what do we mean by a political fight in favor of affordable housing? And this leads to very difficult political discussions, because at the moment when there is a public deficit, when millions of euros are when the budget is too limited, the question is, whom are we going to target? What will be the priorities? Social, affordable market housing, or affordable social housing with rents which are set according to the income of the households, and not only according to the market? Are we going to target excluded people, or families that are easier to satisfy, middle class that earns money? Are we going to target private investment or public investment, or even public subsidies at the different levels, local, regional, national, European, with social counterparts, with social compensations that will be more sustainable? Or are we going to target market segments which will be privatized? These questions were not raised at European level because there was no ambition. So the existence of the ambition is a good news, but in FEANTSA and in the Foundation, we are still very careful, and we are attentive to make sure that these policies that we've been expecting for a long time really target those people who mostly need it, people who live in slums, who are homeless, or living in squats. So it's not only a general housing crisis, undifferentiated housing crisis, but there are a lot of inequalities in terms of housing. Most of the Europeans are well housed, but the poorest part of the population, the most discriminated population, would need more housing policies, more socially affordable housing policies. And this is also one element in the discussion that we're going to have today. And of course, we are not in a terra incognita. There have been Thank you. And I will share my screen.
Est-ce que c'est bon? Vous voyez mon écran?
Is it okay?
Donc, on va maintenant présenter les principaux
I'm going to present the main elements in our 10th overview on social housing in Europe. And there will be 4 parts in our presentation corresponding to the 4 topics. And we will reverse the order and start with figures, key figures from the European Housing Exclusion Index of 2025. Then we'll move on to the issue of homelessness in Europe with a state of play and the main breakthroughs and tendencies in the recent years. We will then move on to a third topic on the affordable housing, which is the topic of the report of this year. To what extent is this solution a solution to housing exclusion in Europe? And last but not least, we will move on to a series of recommendations by Fondation du Logement and FEANTSA for the European Union's affordable housing plan. So a few words based upon our analysis of the European Housing Exclusion Index. A few figures which you know about. So first figures on the housing prices. As you know, they have risen quite a lot across the European Union member states, with the increase of almost 39% for purchases and 14.4% for rents since 2018. And you can see on the graph that both indicators evolve in different ways, with a strong, quick increase of purchases until 2022, and somewhat stabilized curve between 2022 and 2024, when the rent curve is on a more stable increase, slightly more since 2021. What's also interesting, even essential, is to analyze the tendencies of the housing price and to compare it with the evolution of the income, to check the impact of the housing price increase on their budget. And one of the main indicators used at European level, it is a Eurostat data. The share of households spending more than 40% of their disposable income on housing, and when you analyze that particular indicator, we see that it changes the current discussion that says that the housing crisis keeps worsening, and it's that worse that it even affects the middle class. But when you look at that indicator, you see that the share of households spending more than 40% has declined from 11.6% in 2013, 11.6% of households spending more than 40% of their income on housing, to 8.2% in 2024, with a small increase between 2020 and 2023, but we still have figures that do not change. And the second item, the second highlight of this graph, it doesn't affect all the households in the same way. The graph shows the share of households spending more than 40% of their income to housing, according to the quintile of income, with the lowest income quintile corresponding to the 25% of poorest population. And you can see that there is a disproportionate impact of the housing crisis on the lowest income quintile, with 27.8% of households in the lowest income being overburdened versus 7.5% in the second quintile. So we can see that there is a concentration of the difficulties on the lowest income, on the most disadvantaged people in the society. A few words on the development and evolution of the energy prices, which was one of the main topics during the latest years, with a sharp increase of energy costs between 2021 and 2022. Since mid-2023, there is a tendency of stabilization of the energy prices, yet the prices are still very high compared to the year before 2021. And they have quite an impact on the budget of the poorest. There is one indicator showing that the share of the European populations in areas of current debts, for instance, the invoices of energy, and it concerns 7% of the European population, which was behind on utility bills, rising to 16.5% among households living below the poverty threshold. One last element on these indicators and the index, the quality of housing. And there is a tendency, there has been a tendency to an improvement in terms of quality indicators. Housing seems to be of a better quality, with differences from one country to another, of course. We looked at three indicators. The share of the population in overcrowded homes. It concerns almost 17% of the EU population in 2024 and 28.9% among low-income households. And it's a stabilized indicator. Then the second indicator concerns the share of the population living in inadequate housing conditions, so 15.5% of Europeans and 23.5% of those below the poverty line. There is a worsening of these indicators, and it concerns more people at European level. And the last indicator, which we looked at, the severe housing deprivation, so the combination of the first two indicators, the share of the population living in overcrowded and poor and inadequate housing. It concerns 4% of the total population, 9.9% of poor house, with a slight improvement in latest years. Now that we gave you a general overview of the European index and the main housing indicators, we'll now look at the issue of homelessness in Europe, and we'll start with some elements about the latest European highlights. First, we should remind you of the Lisbon Declaration in 2021 and the launch of the European Platform on Combating Homelessness called EPOCH, which was a major breakthrough at European level. It was the first time a policy or a strategy was adopted and to end homelessness by 2030. So all the member states committing themselves to ending homelessness by 2023. Beyond a symbolic feature, there are some activities, concrete activities that were put into place. A methodology was developed, and it has an added value on the sector. Among the other highlights at European level, recent highlights at European level, we could mention new sources of data at European level. For instance, the ad hoc EU Silk ad hoc module, updated in 2023, which gives a new estimate on the share of the population in Europe who have experienced homelessness at a moment in time during their life. So 4.9% of the European population announced that they experienced homelessness during their life. So it's quite an interesting piece of information that gives a new point of view on homelessness. Contrary to what we usually think, we think that it's a fringe phenomenon. Actually, it concerns quite a share of the population at European level. Now, at the level of the countries, among the most main highlights, there was an improvement in terms of data. Many national member states tried to improve the calculation of homeless people on their territory, the count of homeless people. We mentioned the examples of Belgium, Netherlands, and Germany, with quite robust method to count the amount of homeless people. And where data are credible, in those countries where there are credible long-term data to analyze the development, the evolution of homelessness, we can see that there are threatening tendencies and an increase of homelessness in some countries, including in those countries which had a positive track record in terms of the fight against homelessness. They had achieved a reduction of the amount of homeless people in their countries, Finland, Denmark. And now there seems to be a new increase of the amount of homeless people after years of improved results. Among the most dramatic increase, we can mention the situation of Ireland, with the number of adults accommodated in emergency shelters that rose from by 10% between 2014 and 2023. A few information now on the policies and strategies. In the Lisbon Declaration of 2021, the member states had committed themselves to launching political measures on different fronts. On the front of prevention, on the front of access to housing, and on the front of support of homeless people, in order to end homelessness by 2030. Among the positive highlights, we could mention the fact that more and more countries, more and more member states prepared anti-homelessness strategies. 15 member states now have such a national strategy, yet we can see that it varies a lot. The quality, the ambition, and the implementation of these strategies vary a lot from one country to another. So this is also something that we further analyze in the report. It shows, and it's interesting to note, that it's difficult today to analyze the actual efficiency of the strategies. So there needs to be a more fine-tuned analysis of the strategies in the framework of the future European Action Plan, including the European Action Plan for Affordable Housing and the Anti-Poverty European Strategy. To close on this part, there was an objective announced in 2021 to end homelessness by 2030. 4 years later, in 2025, and looking at the tendencies, which are quite threatening and worrying this year, it seems that the objective is quite unrealistic. It will not be achieved. But the fact that we are not on the right track today shouldn't be used as an excuse not to do it, not to pursue the objectives. On the contrary, it should be an incentive to double our efforts in order at least to reverse this downwards tendency. And it should also incentivize to develop more realistic and precise roadmaps. So it's needed, and we'll come back on that later when we discuss about the recommendations. The main two initiatives announced by the European Commission, I repeat, the Affordable Housing Plan and the Anti-Poverty Strategy. Both these initiatives should effectively contribute to the objective of ending homelessness and mean massive, robust public investments, because on that front, the private investments might have an added value, but it will not be enough. It cannot replace public investments. And I will give the floor now to Sarah for the rest of the presentation. Thank you. Yes, indeed. This year was characterized by a focus on homelessness and affordable housing at European level, even if it is not a European competence. Last year, a commissioner in charge of housing was appointed with also the portfolio of energy. He announced a much expected plan for affordable housing that should be published by in spring 2026. And President von der Leyen even said that it should be ready by the end of 2025, so we should have it this year. That's the reason why this year we decided to look at this matter, this topic of affordable housing, raising the question, is affordable housing a solution to housing exclusion in Europe? Before starting the presentation of that chapter, a small game to make sure that you still fit as a fiddle. So, when you hear affordable housing, what comes to your mind in one word? So, and then we will present a cloud of words illustrating your point of view at European level. As there are 250 participants, it will be quite interesting. So the European interest or focus is nothing new. There were some elements relating to housing in the European Pillar of Social Rights when the European platform was created in 2021. Yet, the social considerations, are they the only reason why there is a stronger focus at European level on housing? The housing market is also an opportunity, a strategic, economic and financial opportunity for the European Union. And we could raise the question of knowing whether this is not also the reason why the focus exists. Normally, more affordable housing should be a solution to the housing crisis and solve, in a way, the parts of the housing exclusion problem, but the blurred use of this concept of affordable housing raises questions, basic questions on the future of social housing. What is social housing?
Oui, c'est fait exprès parce que je proposais de partager les nuages de mots, mais c'est pas obligé, on peut le faire plus tard aussi.
Et je te propose qu'on le fasse après les recommandations.
In any case, we can do that after the recommendations. Yes, okay. So what do we mean by affordable housing? There is a quote from someone working for the Melbourne University. So the term affordable housing is widely used but rarely defined, clearly leading to ambiguity in policies and targets. And you need benchmarks to better understand that concept. First, you can use international law based on international human rights, and you can find that in the EU Fundamental Rights Charter, but also in different UN instruments. And in such instruments, you have a definition of affordability from the perspective of human rights. and it says that when someone can pay its rent and still enjoy the other human rights, then you can consider that the housing is affordable. When it comes to OECD, they use a ratio, the price to income ratio, and then there's still a limit, even if they use data quite easily accessible. So as they use ratios and averages, it doesn't give an exhaustive picture of the situation, and there are inequalities between very low income, very high income, and also low and high prices. So there are limits to this way to measure affordability. And then there's also the burden concept, that's to say the share of their income households dedicated to their housing. And generally speaking, the different organizations consider that when you devote 30 to 40% of your income to housing, it is a cost over burden. Eurostat uses the 40% average. And then there's also yet another definition with some limitations as well, because when there is an overburden, you don't know how much is left to pay for your food and for the rest of your needs. Because, for instance, if you take a higher income household, they can overcome the 40% dedicated to the housing. And then there is also another approach based on what is left of your income. That's to say that there is a possibility for people to keep some money every day and still continue to pay for their needs with what is left of their disposable income. But this raises a question because it's difficult to get the data. On top of that, you need to make some very complex calculations. So we'd rather use kind of a combination of the overburden concept and the income left. And usually affordable housing means then that when you've paid your rent, you still can pay for the rest of the expenditures without having any major issue. And then there is another notion that is used in the debates at European level, and it has been used for a few years. And here you see kind of a linguistic shift. Affordable housing is used as kind of a new category of housing units in between social housing and private housing. With a rent in between these two ranges, and it would be aimed at the middle class, whereas social housing would be for low-income households. But in reality, this distinction is not accurate, because in the countries where you find social housing, like the Netherlands or France, middle classes already have access to social housing. For instance, in the Netherlands, 40% of the population can access social housing. In France, 72% of the population accessing social housing. So you see that it's not necessary to create a new kind of housing exclusively dedicated to the middle class. However, it's still what we're going to observe in different countries, where this new category of housing will develop parallel to social housing, and sometimes little by little they replace social housing, and I will explain how. So the first example we've observed is the one of France, and since 2014 a law has created the intermediate rental housing scheme. So it's a subsidized housing sector aimed at institutional investors. Rents are set at 85 to 90% of market levels, and units can be sold after 11 years. So 11 years is quite short, because a household, this is 11 years is very short, and very quickly either the renting contract is renewed, or else you will experience sales situations. So this is about the creation of the intermediate rental housing. And what we see is that there is a progressive shift, as you can see on the chart. So the very social housing units used to benefit part of public investments, but little by little, it's intermediate rental housing that is more expensive, that is for people who earn more money. And today, intermediate rental housing can be given to a household getting 7,500 euros a month. And the very low rent housing will be less and less in the production to the benefit of intermediate rental housing. Then in the UK, we observe more or less the same, because in the 80s, there was a big wave of sales of social housing units with the development of the right to buy policies and the possibility for tenants to buy the housing. And then in 2011, there is the so-called affordable homes program that is introduced, and rents are at 80% of market levels. 80% could be considered as more affordable than prices on the private market. But if you go to a city like London, 80% of market level is totally inaccessible for low-income households. And by the way, rents are 60% higher than council rents. So before that supply of affordable housing was created. So again, you see the same shift. So between 2016 and 2017, only 2% of new homes built by housing associations were still council rent properties. And a big part of the stock was converted to affordable rents between 2012 and 2018. Then next example, Italy, same story. In the 90s, there was big sales of social housing units. And on top of that, there was a specific fund dedicated to the production of public housing that disappears. And because of that lack of resources, people have to resort, housing providers have to resort to private capital. And in 2008, we see what we call edilizia residenziale sociale that appears. And again, they will get most of the public money to produce so-called profitable housing units, replacing very social housing units that are less profitable for investors or for operators who lack funding. And that's how in Milan, between 2010 and 2023, almost 69% of the homes of the units built were sold. More specifically, the least affordable category of subsidized housing. So we see here very clearly that there is a specific mechanism operating. There is a shift between public social housing to the private sector, with a phenomenon with first a decrease in public investment, then money coming from the private sector, because operators, because of a lack of money, are obliged to take private funding, and then a slowing down of the production of very affordable housing for low-income households. And in Italy, one of the arguments they use is that very affordable housing will be given to the middle class, and it will be a social housing tool, a social mix tool, and that's how they justify the decrease in the production of very cheap social housing. And then there is another point to be highlighted, little by little in the UK, but also in the draft legislation on the development of affordable housing units submitted by Deputy Gasparian before the dissolution of the National Assembly in France. We see short-term or fixed-term renting contracts, because before people could stay forever in these housing units, but in France, because of the circumstances, the law was not passed. But anyway, the proposal was on the table, and same in the UK, but there it passed. And what we see is exclusion of low-income households that are considered by financial markets as risky households. So when managers want to please to private investors, they can't take any risk. So low-income households being risky, they can't attract private investors so easily. And this is a trap. Why is it a trap? Because you move from public actions, public production of social housing, that's to say the development of a national housing stock, and we move to another approach to correct the market, but in a limited period of time, generally in the short term, and this will change the housing market in the long run. There is an example of that in Ireland. Half of the social housing units produced after 2017, these units were bought by investment funds. Other example, Germany, where after having sold all the private housing stock to investors, public housing to investors, today we see that 40 billion euros now belong to investment funds, funds that mainly aim at profitability, and in the long run, they would not exclude selling the housing units, getting higher rents, and maintain the housing units to a minimum, to make more profits. And we think that the best response is meeting the housing needs. And if the European Commissioner, Dan Jurgensen, and if President Ursula von der Leyen really want to face the housing crisis, if they want to meet the call of European citizens, if they want to meet the housing needs of European citizens, if they want the EU to help the citizens, they need to meet their needs. And the priority is low income and more vulnerable households, because these households are overexposed to the housing crisis. They dedicate almost 40% of their income to their housing. 1/3 of them experience a housing cost overburden. They spend more than 40% for the housing. And we also have a quick and big gap between the poorest households and the middle class. And we see that low-income households really suffer from housing crisis, mainly single people, single parents, but also tenants who account for 1/3 of the households in Europe, and it's going up. So 1 out of 5 experiences housing cost overburden. So they dedicate a lot of their income to the housing. And to be highlighted, if you compare a household dedicating more than 40% to access ownership and a tenant who dedicates 40% to the rent, we also see another gap, because one will own the house at the end of the process, the other one not. And we have tried to develop simulations for 18 European cities with different households profiles. And you can have a look at the report that is available online. But the outcome of the analysis shows that the private sector is not accessible for low-income households, the poorest one, but also the lower middle class. And as you can see on the table, all the red boxes, this is all the people who can't live in big European cities where you find jobs, training, where you find services aimed at improving their quality of life. And of course, there is some nuances in countries where housing benefits are allocated. It's the case in Brussels, for instance, but generally speaking, it's still complicated or even impossible for low-income households to find a housing in big European cities. The problem is that we don't have an accurate assessment of the needs. Where such data exists, it's not necessarily comparable information. Some countries analyze the needs in housing production without analyzing the fact that there is demand, but also the needs of all the groups who have bad quality housing. You probably remember the estimates developed by the Fondation and FEANTSA regarding homeless people, but also people who live in inappropriate housing. So the problem is demand, but also all those who have housing or not, but who would need a better housing unit, a better home. And that's why we need the European Union in its plan for affordable housing. I'm forgetting the consequences of this shift. First of all, housing exclusion. So public authorities, when they support too much housing that is not accessible to low-income households, will no longer be able to fight against homelessness and rough sleeping. There's also a risk of eviction and homelessness because when the rents are too high, households run the risk to be evicted, and this entails an increase in homelessness. It's also financial insecurity for households. And in 2024, Eurofound states that 29% of households in the European Union reported having difficulty making ends meet, compared with 22% in 2023, an increase of 31.8%, even if there is stabilization of energy prices since then. So what do we need? We need that the European Union sets a clear regulatory framework allowing sustainable housing supply with limited prices when it comes to the production to avoid fluctuations on the private sector. The EU needs to support public bodies or non-commercial organizations where profits are reinvested in housing, organizations that protect public interest. On top of that, we need public investments, and that's what they did in Vienna or in France in the last years. So what about the recommendations of two organizations regarding the European Union's affordable housing plan? First of all, respect the subsidiarity principle, because housing policies fall under the responsibility of the member states. It's not part of the European Union's competences, and we want to keep that subsidiarity principle because we think that each country has its specificities, and the states should be able to meet the needs of their population. They also need to prioritize the needs and not only the demand. They also need to take into consideration the commitment about no more homelessness by 2030. So member states engage in the fight against homelessness so that it's disappear, it's eradicated by 2030. Then also further develop and step up efforts in programs like Housing First program. And to do that, we need public investments, but also support to the projects. These projects should be given priority in all the programs that will be implemented. On top of that, we need to protect and expand social housing and make sure that discussions around services of general interest do not challenge what is done in the countries where social housing is efficient, like in France. And we are against a change in the definition of services of general interest, because housing should be collective asset, a public good, in order to meet the needs when people experience problems. It's not about correcting market failures. Then guarantee sufficient European funding. The EU budget aims at housing through a very big fund. But even if we welcome the news, we hope that it will remain a priority of the EU, but these funds will be competing with many other issues. So we absolutely need to make sure that the money is dedicated to housing and that the different financial envelopes are not reduced to the minimum. Then the European Social Fund that should fight against poverty and bad quality housing, dedicates fund to these issues, and then make sure that it's deployed on the territories. And then money coming from the EU should always be submitted to strict counterparts. That's to say, a framework as a support to social housing in the long run. Then protect tenants, because we are aware that they are very vulnerable in the current situation. Then think about minimum housing sectors. We're not asking for binding legislation. And we should not avoid complying with national policies, but we need a consensus on common minimum standards to protect tenants. And then the EU should also adopt budgetary rules allowing public investment in social housing, and the development of policies should be followed up in the framework of the European semester. And then also make sure that there is a socially fair implementation of the Green Deal steps, because we're well aware that building are one source of greenhouse gases, but despite of that, we need to make sure that we first refurbish buildings where low-income people are living, because in winter they are cold, in summer they are too hot. So I hope that I've been clear in my presentation. Feel free to share your questions in the chat, and maybe Margaux will be able to show us the cloud of words, and then I will give the floor to our different speakers.
Oui, je partage. Alors,
yes, absolutely. I will share the cloud of words.
Bon, les résultats sont un peu... comment dire? On a eu beaucoup de résultats, c'est pas évident.
It goes a lot of words, so it's very difficult to draw some conclusions and to analyze all these words. There are so many. But you can make a snapshot of the screen. Affordability is written in big. Public social housing as well. Social housing.
ça vous a beaucoup inspiré, effectivement. Des
So
loyers,
you've been inspired quite a lot by the presentation. And then equality,
des ressources suffisantes pour couvrir les loyers,
enough resources to cover the rents, low rents,
abordable pour qui,
affordability for whom, starting a new life cheap. So we see that there is a consensus on the affordability concept. So we need to produce sufficiently low rents to allow households to live their life when they've paid their rents. So thank you very much, Margaux, for this very surprising exercise. And this allows us to take stock of your different impressions. So now I give the floor to Matthew Baldwin, managing the Housing Task Force at the European Commission. And then I will give the floor to Tim White and Ben Rickey, who is a researcher in sociology in the Queen Mary University of London and in the London School of Economics, and then Rickey, managing Housing First program in the region of Paris. And they will express their views on the presentation, on the report they've read before the presentation, and then we will have a discussion all together. Matthew, you have the floor.
Merci Sarah. Bonjour tout le monde. Hello,
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for this excellent presentation, and makes us even more proud that we appointed you to our Housing Advisory Board, and thank you for all your work on that. Not on behalf of anyone but yourself, but we see your determination and passion for the most disadvantaged in this, and that's really, really valuable to our board. And thank you, FEANTSA, for organizing this discussion and inviting me to contribute to it. It's great work. The report, particularly for those of us who are new to the business of housing and housing exclusion, I learned a lot from reading it. And your timing is excellent because, as you know, Sarah, and we are now in a slightly faster calendar for producing the affordable housing plan than we thought we were before. We are trying to produce this now for the 16th of December. So all systems are go in that respect. So your timing, as ever, is really impeccable here. Just a few things I picked out from the report. And I think we all know that we have different difficulties in trying to get a common measurement standard for housing deprivation, for homelessness. I am struck by, and this actually applies in other areas as well, that there's a decline in the average numbers, but some sharp increases in a number of countries. And that fits, if you like, with our sense of the housing market and the squeeze that is coming down, and of course the most vulnerable parts of the community being most affected by that. I'm struck also, I think you mentioned this, Sarah, that there are more people living in inadequate housing, however that is measured, than there were 3 years ago. And then I think you also referred to it, I think on page 66, how private rental accommodation is pretty much unaffordable, particularly again for the disadvantaged in all major cities. Your slides on that were very, very telling. Picking out from the angle of the European Union, we are, of course, very committed to the Lisbon Declaration, very committed to seeing that advance. We note that there are still a number of member states who don't yet have homelessness strategies. And we note quite a lot of differences in the way member states are approaching this. I think your report fills some of those gaps well. With the different assessments from FEANTSA members, but it is clear that I think we need to do more in terms of monitoring and assisting member states to do this. I cannot resist, Sarah, the temptation to tease you a little bit that your first recommendation is to respect subsidiarity and make sure that that is left to member states and regions and local authorities. And then in the other 9 recommendations, you tell us to jump in all over the place. And I do understand fundamentally what you're about. We do respect subsidiarity in a real way. We are not in the European Commission trying to take over the provision of housing, social housing, or indeed housing for the most vulnerable. We do believe and hope that in the report we can identify areas where we can add some value to those efforts, and including in these particular areas. As to the particular concerns you have around affordability, if I can tackle that big elephant in the room, we do understand the concerns about residualization of the social housing sector, and that it'll end up being, if you like, residualized or ghettoized for the most disadvantaged and vulnerable if we go with this affordable housing category. So I really want to stress this. We are not planning to come with any universal European definition of affordability. We do have one for state aid purposes, but if you look at that, it's indeed very broad. It says essentially that when there are no good market outcomes or a market failure, then the case for affordability, including social, is made. So we've kept that deliberately open because we recognize the differences in all the different member state systems. And I think it's important. Again, we support the idea of the housing continuum. We recognize the diversity of systems, and we need to do that if we're going to preserve strong social housing systems. Again, I'm not yet able to say what the report will contain, but I do hope and believe it'll be strong on the importance of social housing. And then on the I mean, maybe the confusion is in the title. When we talk about the European Affordable Housing Plan, it is not just about affordable housing supply in that additional category that people are talking about. It's about increasing affordability, and there are many measures that need to work at the same time in all sectors, but particularly for the most vulnerable. One or two other issues I note that people are wishing to see more safeguards in what is proposed. Please have a look at the detail of what's currently under consultation on the state aid side. We're looking at 20 years provisions for durability, and that's important. The World Voice is calling for much shorter periods than that. We're looking at the ideas of lower rents for people under low incomes who cannot afford cost rental. We see this working in several systems across Europe. It's certainly not a case of, if you go to cost rental, that abandoning any sense of what the most vulnerable need or can afford. And I think we recognize there will always be the need for some sort of grant component to decrease cost rents for low income households. And then if I could just conclude by saying, wherever we sit in the Commission, and of course we're in the Housing Task Force, we're not speaking for all the different parts of the system, we see strong support for the idea of housing-led, housing-first solutions for tackling homelessness by all means possible. Strong support for ways of trying to strengthen the Lisbon process and help member states meet their commitments under that process. The need to assist member states in quantifying their needs for addressing the Lisbon targets of ending homelessness. So really helping them allowing us to help them in the most meaningful way possible. And then last but not least, we are pleased in the housing part of the Commission with the strong references to homelessness in the context of the next MFF. I think that sends a powerful political signal about the importance of this issue. And we should, if I could suggest, make sure that is maintained in the version that's agreed by the Council and the Parliament. So those are my quick remarks. Thank you again for having me on, and I'm sure I've missed out lots of very relevant things that my team would have wanted me to say, but I'm very grateful for the chance. I'm looking forward to hearing what Tim and Ben have to say. Cheers.
Should I fire away?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I think I might have a slightly longer response, if that's okay. How long do I have exactly? Like 15 minutes? Perfect. So I want to start by just saying thank you for producing this useful and kind of thorough resource on the state of housing in Europe. I learned a huge amount from this report, kind of from the politics of measuring and quantifying homelessness to the sort of potentials and limitations of a more coordinated European housing strategy. And I want to focus on just a couple of key issues in the report that chime with my own work on housing, financialization, and inequality. So the first one is the sort of contradictions of trying to deliver through market mechanisms housing in line with social need. So housing that's genuinely affordable to those who need it most. And as the report points out, the European Commission is caught between these kind of competing impulses of, on the one hand, treating housing as a financial asset to kind of boost investment and economic growth, and on the other, seeing it as sort of a right of sorts. And the report charts, I think, really thoroughly how governments across Europe have basically reinvented the meaning of affordability to justify a turn away from genuinely affordable housing and towards market facilitated kind of intermediate forms of housing. And the sort of favorable financial vehicles and regulations developed over recent years for intermediate housing in places like France, Italy, Sweden, and the UK can really be seen as a way of, I think, de-risking investments for institutional investors. And the consequences of this are really material. You know, they're basically diverting resources away from housing for the most vulnerable. And we see how actual social housing is being increasingly sidelined and residualized. And I think the way that these programs and kind of incentives for this intermediate band of housing have unfolded, it really demonstrates that this sort of cuddly capitalism approach to affordable housing does not work. This attempt to kind of cajole actors who have a fiduciary duty to maximize returns to their shareholders into producing housing for those most in need. And when you have a system that ultimately hinges on these kind of market incentives, I think it's really clear that housing fails to align with social need, which is, as this report I think so clearly sets out, that need is most urgent among kind of low-income households. So particularly since the global financial crisis, the flood of private finance into housing markets has basically been one of the main things pushing up prices. And I think this kind of ushering of institutional investors into social and affordable housing provision is relying on the same set of actors and imperatives that have been driving the housing crisis over recent decades to fix it. So it's a bit like asking the wolf to rebuild the pig's houses. Next, I want to move on to supply. I think this is a bit of a kind of red herring that I want to sort of address in the mainstream debate on housing. You know, undoubtedly, in many places, we need more housing of many varieties to be built. But the kind of dominant political discourse is that we just need to kind of build. And actually, the UK Housing Secretary has a sort of Trump-like hat that says "Build, baby, build" on it. It's kind of pushing this narrative that we need to kind of cut the red tape and let the real estate sector do its thing, I suppose, regardless of what type of housing is being built and at what price point. And the kind of theory is that this will ultimately bring down prices. And I think this is based on a very kind of narrow conception of the housing problem, rooted in neoclassical economics. And I think, as the report shows in different ways, the housing crisis is more one of distribution than it is of quantity and supply. You know, we live in an increasingly unequal world where investors and the wealthiest households accumulate vast portfolios of homes, whilst low-income and marginalized households have increasingly little. And I think this is you know, it's this that we really need to be addressing. Flooding the market with kind of high-cost housing while waiting lists for social housing are ballooning is clearly going to make the situation worse. And And even if it were true that supply is the answer to the problems, it's certainly true that institutional investors have a kind of vested interest in undersupply to keep prices high. They sort of thrive off shortages. But of course, this narrative that we just need to build is so dominant because it supports the interests of industry and kind of gives the private market license to produce housing at the price point that suits them. In the UK, for example, our new housing strategy hinges around ushering private equity into build to rent, which delivers exclusively for kind of high income young professionals and has significantly pushed up rents in some London neighbourhoods where it's concentrated. So in all, I think we need to contest this supply myth and the work it's doing to prop up a kind of dysfunctional market-led housing system. And I really like this idea in the report of focusing not on demand, but on need. Finally, the third point, I just want to kind of address the worrying political landscape and the relationship between the far right and the housing crisis. I think even though this is a link only just kind of starting to be made in the mainstream debate, I think it's really clear that housing is playing a major role in the kind of rising discontentment and disenfranchisement behind the far right in Europe. As this report so vividly describes, vast numbers of people are now spending, the lion's share of their incomes on rent. They're saddled with large amounts of debt. They're living in cramped and moldy conditions. They're precarious and they're kind of uncertain about the future. And this understandably undermines faith in governments and in democracy more broadly. It means people are more susceptible to narratives blaming migrants, for example. And also the housing crisis is being directly weaponized by far-right parties, blaming outsiders for pushing up prices and taking all the houses, as we've seen in the Netherlands, and we're now increasingly seeing in the UK too. And in turn, as really helpfully detailed in this report, we're seeing how far-right governments kind of worsen the housing crisis when they come into power. The report shows how in Finland, the Netherlands, Italy, far-right governments have imposed these kind of aggressive austerity measures, further slashing welfare and social security, and kind of further ostracizing the most vulnerable. And this kind of changing political climate even feeds into the question of, documentation of measurement, which I thought was really interesting. For example, in Hungary, where budgets for kind of surveys on homelessness have been cut, kind of hampering our understandings of the homeless problem and potential solutions. So I think we're stuck in this kind of vicious cycle where the rising cost of housing is driving the rise of the far right, which is then resulting in the enactment of policies that worsen the housing crisis and result in the further marginalization of the most vulnerable. So I think just to kind of wrap up, I think it's really clear as this report acknowledges that whilst programs that kind of directly address homelessness in the now are critical, what we need are these kind of structural measures to address the housing crisis at its very core, which in my opinion needs to center on systematically decommodifying housing. And this means kind of in the immediate term, curbing speculative activity, significantly strengthening the rights of tenants and other types of occupant, and also mass public housing programs. I think also we need to look at this within a broader picture of kind of intensifying inequality across the world. Wealth concentration and polarization absolutely feeds into this picture, because what do those with money do? They buy assets, including housing, and this is a self-reinforcing spiral that makes everything unaffordable for the rest of us, including increasingly middle-income households. I think this also calls for measures like taxing extreme wealth and funneling it into essential social services. I'm going to finish there. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Tim, pour cette intervention
Thank you, Tim,
sur ce sujet.
for
Je vais
your
passer la parole à
reaction.
Rickey, qui est en charge
I will give the floor to Enrique, who is in charge of a Housing First program for the city of Paris, who is going to tell us about what it means to find housing in order to have affordable housing in a big city like Paris. Ben, thank you, Sarah.
I'm going to do my presentation in English because I thought it might be more accessible to the majority of participants. And thanks, firstly, like Tim and Matthew, I'd like to thank both the Fondation pour le Logement and the FEANTSA for this, both this report and the previous reports that I've read with great interest, and I've referenced a lot. And I think it's stimulating. It's sometimes shocking to see the state of housing in Europe, but it's always stimulating. And to have these spaces is really, really valuable to talk about those issues. So I'm Benedict Rickey. I'm the Housing First Coordinator in Paris City Hall. I oversee our 15-point action plan that seeks to place housing at the heart of our homelessness strategy, building on work over the last 20 years done by the City Hall and our partners. I've been asked to talk concretely about how we use housing to address homelessness in Paris, the challenges we face, and what affordable housing should play, if any, in this policy. And I've got basically 5 simple points I want to make. And I'll take you through them. So the first one, in Paris, like in many major European cities, we're faced with what I would call a perfect storm. So we've got on the one hand high and rising needs, and on the other hand, a housing crisis, which is driving more and more people to seek a social home. So if we talk about high and rising needs, the situation is particularly alarming in Paris. We have 47,000 shelter beds and about as many people in those beds, around 3,500 people sleeping rough at any one time, at least when we count them in January. A further 20,000 beds in temporary housing. So on the one hand, we could say it's roughly 70,000 people who are either homeless or in temporary accommodation, plus other priority groups, of course, like sofa surfers that whose needs we struggle to meet. The scale and the severity of the housing crisis is now driving more and more households to seek a social home. So to illustrate that with figures, in Paris, we've gone from 100,000 people on our social housing waiting lists in 2001 to over 300,000 in 2024. To put that in perspective, we have around 260,000 social homes in Paris. So we could empty our whole social housing park and then fill them with all the people on our waiting list the following day, just to give you an idea. The turnover in the social housing sector has dropped to historic lows for the reasons that we've already talked about. Around 3% of homes now become available every year. That's the main source of housing that we can provide to particularly homeless families. This means that available properties have now dropped from around 10 to 11,000 per year in 2022, 2023 to 9,000 in 2024. So in Paris, we now make 1 social housing allocation for every 30 households on our waiting lists. So that's my first point. The second point is that faced by rising needs and a deepening social housing crisis, real social housing, real regulated social rents is, of course, at the heart of our strategy to combat homelessness, with an ambitious social housing policy covering both construction and allocations. And when I say real social housing, I'm talking about 6 to 14 euros per meter squared for a property, which is for the most part, less than half of our private rents in Paris, which are around an average of 30 euros per meter squared in the private sector. This is what we've done in Paris. On the one hand, we've worked on building new social homes. Just as a bit of context, in 2001, the Urban Renewal Law, which was brought in at the request of the Fondation pour le Logement, set a target to all large urban areas to achieve 25% of social homes by 2025. In fact, it was 20% and then later increased it to 25%. In spite of having only 13% of social homes in Paris and limited developable land, our successive elected officials and mayors have embraced that target, and we have now achieved it. 25% of social homes. We've built over 100,000 social homes in the last 25 years. That's thanks to a substantial investment budget and a whole social housing ecosystem that's used every possible means to develop new social homes. That includes both classic social homes for families, but also congregate housing first units and other types of supported housing, which we call pension famille. The rents of these social homes are regulated centrally, and most are truly affordable even to those on the lowest income, as we've demonstrated with our fast track system. Even the PLS, which we talked about earlier on, the high rents, if people have housing benefits, they're accessible. A lot of them are still accessible to people on the lowest incomes. So that's the first point. I'll work on producing new social homes, and we've done, and then we've worked on allocations. So Paris City Hall and our partners, including the state and social landlords, have a priority-led housing allocation system, which is dual-pronged. So we've got a points-based priority system for all households. So at least for Paris, we select those based on needs. And second, we have a fast-track process where we rehouse around 1,300 high-priority households every year, most of whom are homeless or leaving temporary housing. Thanks to this dual-pronged approach, we've gone from 10% of allocations in 2017 to those who are leaving shelters and who are rough sleepers, to 17% in 2024. The national figure is 8%, so we're about double the national average. It's still insufficient, but we've made a lot of progress to move in the right direction. That's the second point. The third point is that an ambitious social housing strategy is necessary, but it's not sufficient for the most vulnerable groups. This strategy needs to work hand in hand with three other things. First, outreach services and shelters. We know that harder to reach groups face multiple barriers to accessing housing and other rights, and without specific work on access to housing by outreach teams and other drop-in centres, rough sleepers will struggle to access a home. I'd like to talk about just two very concrete examples of what we've done in Paris on that area. First, accessing social homes. In 2020, rough sleepers were included in our high priority group in our fast track process that I mentioned earlier on. And by 2022, we were only rehousing around 60 rough sleepers a year through that route. We realized we had to tool up the professionals from our street outreach and drop-in teams who were attending our access to housing training. So who weren't attending our access to housing training, sorry. So since 2023, we've run a dedicated training session for those professionals every year. And in part, as a result of this work, we've almost doubled the number of rough sleepers rehoused from around 60 in 2022 to around 105 in 2024. Another concrete example is accessing our congregate housing first units for rough sleepers. In Paris, we have around 70 of these congregate housing sites and around 1,700 units that target single people with a history of homelessness or who don't have their own home. They're called pension famille in French. In 2022, Paris was allocating, Paris City Hall was allocating around 28% of those homes to street homeless people or people with no fixed abode. Inspired by some great work done by a charity in the 9th arrondissement to rehouse 4 street homeless people in a new congregate site, we decided to pilot test this approach with 4 other congregate sites in 2023. And since we've mainstreamed this approach, which means that today we've gone from 28% of street homeless and no fixed abode rehousings to 56% by 2024. And by speaking of which, we're very proud because it's been picked up by the Inspiring Practices Brief paper that's coming out later this month by Epoch. So that's one key element. Outreach is key. So are support services. I'm not going to go into details around that because I'm already probably longer than I should be, but we're really proud because we support 2 housing first services, one ACT service called Un Chez Soi d'abord, and one ICM service, which is an innovative project called Bye Bye la Rue. And through that means, by providing with real social homes, we help to rehouse 15 to 20 chronic rough sleepers every year over the last 3 years. And the reality of these projects is a far cry from many of the fears people have expressed in the past about housing first projects. We do have challenging situations, but for the vast majority of those housing first users, they're accessing real social homes and they get on fine with their neighbours, and we're not creating unlivable ghettos in the social housing sector. The last point I wanted to make is social support services are key, but so are health and other services, and sometimes we need to do more in that field. So that's my third point. Social housing is important, but not enough. Fourthly, it's not enough to work on all of that. It's also critical to better regulate the private housing sector to tackle the housing crisis at the source, as Tim was saying earlier on. Like most large metropolitan areas in Europe, Paris is faced by three major challenges. One, the explosion of Airbnb. Two, rising rents. Three, the increase in second homes. Paris has been at the forefront of efforts to regulate the private sector. We've contributed to international legislation and European regulations on Airbnb. We've pilot tested and then mainstreamed an innovative rent cap system that has led to a 5% reduction in rents and helped hundreds of tenants to claw back overpaid rent. And we've since, in fact, taken over the service. We've now running that within Paris City Hall, the service that oversees those rent caps, and we have received 4,000 requests in the last 2 years. However, we don't have the right tools to address undoubtedly the biggest regulatory challenge, the rise in second homes. Primarily as a result of this rise, we have lost an estimated 71,000 homes from the private rented sector in the last decade in Paris. 71,000 homes. It's really hard to visualize, but it's become a very, very high priority of Jacques Baudrier, who's Anne Hidalgo's housing lead, who wants to combat this by introducing a tax on the value of second homes that's comparable to those that have been tested in Vancouver and Brussels. I'd like to also insist on the fact that this is a challenge not just for the homelessness strategy, it's also a challenge for Paris's dynamic in general and its ability to attract young people, young professionals, students, because there are just fewer and fewer private rented properties available. So that's my fourth point: regulate the private sector better and continue to reinforce that work. And finally, in this context of the erosion of the private sector in Paris, our mayor, Anne Hidalgo, firmly believes that affordable housing should be part of our housing mix, not to replace social homes, but to secure affordable rents for those on middle incomes. As I said, Paris is facing that dual challenge. Rents are stubbornly high, on average 30 euros per metre squared, and the sector is steadily being eroded by Airbnb and second homes. So to combat this, in 2020, Anne Hidalgo committed to create a land trust, which in French is called a foncière, that would purchase buildings and then rent them to social housing providers over a long period, for instance, 50 years, who would then apply intermediate rents at least 25% below market rate. The Land Trust was formally launched early this year, and the hope is it will purchase its first buildings in the coming months. Now, I know the concerns that you have all expressed and the report underlines around the risk that this sort of affordable housing comes to substitute for social housing, and it's that it becomes just another way of undermining good work that's been done historically to produce real affordable homes. Our mayor and our elected official on this share your concerns and have done everything in their power to ensure that this vehicle does not worsen the situation in Paris, quite the contrary. So firstly, it's a product that is not in competition with social housing. Paris sees it more as a tool to regulate the private sector than to replace popular social homes. So firstly, the aim is to produce 400 units per year that are in addition to our social housing units that we're going to continue to produce. We're seeking to go from 25% to 30% of social housing stock between now and 2035, producing around 4,000 real social homes every year. Secondly, it doesn't target the same households. It addresses the housing needs of 400,000 middle-income households who are between 1,400 and 3,800 euros per year, per month, and per person, most of whom are highly unlikely to be rehoused in social homes. So that's the first point. It's not in competition with social homes. And secondly, it's a tool to regulate the private rented sector, not to undermine social housing. It's a key tool in the fight against financialization of housing in Paris, because it removes properties from a market logic and prevents speculation. The funding model means that by handing them over to social landlords, all the rents taken can be used to reinvest in renovating existing stock and buying future properties, and ensure that the rents will not continue to rise in line with market rents. In short, Paris places real social housing at the heart of its integrated homelessness strategy, but also seeks to curtail the worst excesses of private sector housing to ensure Parisians on low and middle incomes can access quality housing. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and any questions you may have.
Merci beaucoup, Ben, pour cette
Thank you, Ben,
présentation et cette
for this presentation and your remarks on the report. Now you can raise your question in the chat. I see that there are hands risen, but we will take written questions to avoid too many difficulties. So you have some seconds to think about your questions and put them in writing. But first, I'd like to answer Matthew's question on the issue of recommendations from the European Commission to the European Commission, that should respect the principle of subsidiarity and also affects national level decisions. I think that on one hand, we could have European recommendations in the competence under the remit of the European Commission to valorize social housing for the disadvantaged populations, but also recommendations based upon good practices, which are, in a way, opinions or incentives to the member states to push them draft a regulation around rent reports, but also rent controls. We can see that in Paris it was the case, and with success. So it may be a good practice on the part of the Commission that would be encouraged by, incentivized by the European Commission rather than imposed on the member states. And we know that the European Commission should take, when it takes guidelines and guidance that fits with our concerns, it is also a lever to achieve a solution. There are comments in the chat. Checking whether these comments are questions. Matthew would like to answer.
No, thank you very much, Sarah. That's very helpful clarification. I think we agree on a lot. I'm not yet in a position to talk about the balance of how we're going to address things, but what I'm absolutely clear on is what I call the long wagging finger at the Commission is not a good formula for success in an area where we don't have formal competence, and we're not planning to go down that road. Whether we end up with recommendations or guidance in some of these areas, I think that's quite likely. There are, however, some areas, and indeed Ben pinpointed others, where we are pressed to step in, and including on the vexed question of short-term rentals. You'll have heard President von der Leyen commitment to bring forward a further legislative proposal on that. Again, I hope we can see that not as the Commission saying that this is what you have to do, but trying to create a little bit more legal space for cities in particular to address the issues. And that's the spirit in which I think we do see areas where we might be trying to exercise a bit more competence as relevant. The other area, of course, is on finance, where, again, I wish we had more money to contribute, but we want to use what tools we have to effectively marshal those funds and bring them to best effect to leverage more and better social and affordable housing. So that's the goal. So I don't want to prolong the debate, which is, as a Brit, a sterile one about the issues of competence, but I think we are in the same place. Thank you. And Ruth's explanation in the chat is also very helpful. I stop now. Thank you.
Alors, une question sur l'outre-mer.
A question on the overseas, because it's true that there are regions there that are related to EU member states, and Celine is asking if there is a specific approach for these territories that belong to EU countries. How are we going to deal with inappropriate housing in these lands? So, is there a possibility to deal with these territories? And there is a second question on community land trust. Do you have some visibility on the profile of households benefiting from these solidarity-based steps? Are you in a position to develop some supply for very low-income households? And there is a third question in the chat, but maybe you can answer regarding overseas territories.
Regarding the issues of French overseas territories, les Outre-mer, I'm not competent to really provide an overview of what's done differently. There are some, but I think that was perhaps a question for, was that a question for Matthew? Anyway, I'll come back to you on the more on the question of our affordable housing and what it will target. Just to clarify, in Paris we have two forms of affordable housing. One is what we call in French bail réel solidaire, which I would translate as rent to buy, where middle-income households can rent a property and become leaseholders in the long term. And the other model of affordable housing is one we've just introduced, which is a pure rental system. And we have no units available, so we haven't got a concrete example yet, but the objective is to be at 25% below market rate and to target those who are between 1,400 euros per month and let me just get the other figure, just over 3,000, I think, per month per person, 3,800 per month per person. So quite a broad spectrum. If you think about 1,400 is just above minimum wage in France, and 3,800 is well above median income. So it's quite a broad spectrum. It includes people on the bottom end who could potentially qualify for social housing, but who are rarely high priority given the level of demand. And on the upper end of the spectrum who don't qualify because their incomes are too high. So yeah, there is an issue there around who we prioritize within that spectrum. And the current discussions I had with my colleague was that the social landlords will run an allocations process that is actually quite comparable to the social housing sector, which is based on priority need. Which could lead us to actually to rehouse those on the lowest end of the spectrum, assuming that the rents are affordable for them. I hope that responds to that. It comes back to your question.
Would you like me to jump in?
Je pense que pardon, c'était pour répondre à la question sur les régions ultra-périphériques.
I just wanted to answer. I give you the floor, Matthew.
Donc, je suis tout à fait prêt à attendre ce que vous voulez dire, madame. Je ne sais pas qui parle pour l'instant. C'est vous, Céline, qui veut dire quelque chose?
Céline, are you the one?
La question sur
Céline raised a question on European ultra-peripheral areas. Is there specific steps from the Commission for these regions that are very specific?
Je peux être très bref. Nous sommes bien connaissants des questions des départements d'outre-mer.
Well aware of what happens in overseas territories.
Et ça, c'est très important de garder en tête. Je ne peux pas être très spécifique.
Very important to bear that in mind. I can't give you the specifics for the time being, but we're well aware in the Commission of how important it is to bear that in mind. And let me add just a few words.
To be clear, not very good French, around the importance of community land trusts. We are very keen to understand how, I mean, they've been around so long and they're so important, it's almost insulting to call them an alternative model. But we recognize the importance they bring, in particular addressing the question of land, which is such a high percentage of the overall cost, particularly, of course, in cities. My excellent colleague, Stepan Rybko, many of you will know, even before he sold his soul and came to work with us in the European Commission, he makes the point that they are an interesting approach. We want to try to validate them. We're not sure that they're going to be at this stage a major solution for the lowest income on homeless people, but we do think they can relieve some of the pressures on the so-called affordable sector, and in particular by finding appropriate and low impact solutions for people who can bring a little bit of equity to the picture. And if I may just add one last point, I see some interest in Central and Eastern Europe in developing these. These shouldn't be seen as just models that work in the Netherlands and Denmark and so on. And so if we can encourage Central and Eastern European countries who've got great issues around owner occupancy, housing poverty, to start them thinking about this as well, and to try to encourage impact investors in this area. Thank you.
And can I just come back on the point that Matthew was making about community land trust, because I think there's perhaps I wasn't clear enough in my presentation. We have now 3 different models of community land trust within Paris, and they're used for different products. So we use the community land trust model to produce real social homes. So that Paris purchases properties by different mechanisms, and then makes them available to a social landlord with a rent over a prolonged 50, 60, 70 year contract. And we use that mechanism but also for the intermediate products. So you don't have to just use it to provide these intermediate products. You can also use it to produce real social homes. And it essentially is a form of investment subsidy to these properties over the long term, of course. But it does mean that we're reinvesting all of the rents back into the initial purchase of the land. Sorry, to come back on that, I think it's a tool that's really powerful, but it does need to be capitalized, and that's where the issue comes in. In major urban areas, you need lots of capital up front, which unfortunately in France, the state is not providing those big, large investment subsidies, and the only reason Paris has been able to have such an ambitious social housing program is because we've been investing hundreds of millions of euros over a long period. So you really need that upfront investment, so public investment.
Merci beaucoup pour cet échange très riche.
Thank you very much for this very interesting exchange. I think that everybody is interested in community land trust and Réel Solidaire. So, Ben, you are invited to share your presentation so that we can put it on our respective sites. I think that we are reaching the end of this meeting. There is a question in the chat that seems interesting to me. Indeed, we've talked a lot about countries where there is social housing stock with a renting culture. And we wonder if there are perspectives for Eastern European countries where you mostly have owners occupying their housing. So, Margaux, could you please give some answers on that, picking up on the report? Or maybe Ruth, how is it possible to fight against homelessness in Eastern European countries and in Central Europe?
Perhaps I can start and Margaux can jump in if she wants to add anything. So I would say that there are various issues. I think the high level of owner-occupied stock, and especially in some areas, very poor quality owner-occupied stock is a real challenge. And I think so far that the track record of both EU and national funding in reaching those worst housed households is very poor. And there's a growing tendency to focus on electrification, heat pumps, etc. And they're pretty far from the concerns of people who are cooking on solid fuel or heating with solid fuel, have very inadequate air quality, and their houses are simply cold, damp, and unhealthy. So I think that there is, again, a very political question about what do we prioritize and what are the real needs. And I think it's also like we should avoid shortcuts everywhere. So we have a very strong message about social housing, but Ben said it very clearly, even in Paris, where there's a lot of social housing and it does a lot of the heavy lifting, it can't do it all. So you have to go and meet the needs where they are. And I think when it comes to homelessness, many Eastern European countries have seen quite a rapid expansion of the shelter sector, often with not very dignified conditions in shelter. And we need to not wait as long as we have in Western Europe before we start designing a way out of that very inadequate and unstructural response to homelessness. And I think that some of those housing markets are where house prices are actually increasing the fastest in Europe at the moment. So there will be a need for more affordable rental housing. And countries are faced with a really tough dilemma, like, can we raise capital subsidies to have social housing that meets social needs, or do we go for a fix, like what we've been talking about here, with the kind of less affordable forms of social housing that provide a response but won't fundamentally solve problems like homelessness, overcrowding, people living in inadequate housing, and they won't do that over the long term. I think the regulation of the private rental market is really key, and there's huge variation in the adequacy of basic tenancy law across the European Union, and bigger and smaller black rental markets. So there's an opportunity to make the private rental sector a more suitable place for people to live. So those are some reflections. Maybe to say that the EU budget can play a role there, and at least until now, evening out regional disparities has been a major function of cohesion policy, and this could be a huge added value of the European Union in the housing area.
Merci Ruth. Margaux, je ne sais pas si tu veux ajouter quelque chose.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Anything to add, Margaux? No? So, very well. There's also a question in the chat, but I think that there is a clear answer in the report regarding the possibility for the European Commission to work on affordable housing production if there is a very tough regulation of the housing market, and also a robust public social housing plan with substantial funding, including at European level, with the aim of eliminating the unsustainability of housing. And I think that this was really the objective of this report. It was to shed some light on the conditions in which the Commission can have substantial impact on housing for low-income or very low-income households, and the need for the Commission to give priority to these households. And I think that we provide quite a solid answer to that in the report. Matthew also gave us some clarifications on the intent of the European Commission. So it answers Cesare's question. Anything else to add before we move on to the conclusion? I think that we've provided an answer to almost everybody. In any case, I hope that you will have food for thought after this meeting. And I hope that you've had access to the report where you can find many examples. Thank you very much to the speakers. And before I give the floor to Ruth for the conclusions, I would also like to thank Margaux Charbonnier, who is the writer of the report. She did an excellent job, and it is our first report, the 10th overview of the housing, and it's very relevant. So Ruth, you have the floor for the conclusions.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. And I would like to echo those congratulations and thanks to Margaux. It's not easy to take this on, especially in its 10th edition, and she's done a really fantastic job. So thanks for that. Thanks, Sarah, for the moderation and also for your substantial contribution to the report, and to all the speakers. I think that one of the reasons we do this report and one of the reasons we exist at all, both as FEANTSA and as the Fondation pour le Logement, is that we firmly believe in robust public debate about housing, about how we solve the problems of housing exclusion and homelessness. We have lobbied for the European Union to take more action in this area, and we're definitely not pushing back on the EU stepping into this space. However, we don't have the plan yet. There are a lot of open questions, and I think it's normal that we see both opportunities and risks, and we think it's our job to bring the evidence to the table and to try and shape what's coming. And I think today has been a really useful exercise in that respect. Sarah and Margaux did such a great job presenting the report, and it's available online, so I won't say much more about its content, but I think if you take one thing away from today, it's that the housing crisis does not affect us all equally, and if we want to solve the problems of housing exclusion, we need to design measures that are fit for that purpose, and just more affordable housing, or indeed, as Tim pointed out, more of the things we've been doing wrong over the past few decades will not solve those problems. I think it was incredibly valuable to get into the detail of who really is struggling in our housing systems and in our housing markets, and to start teasing out some of the ultimately choices that we have to make if we want to address those needs. So I think in terms of the respondents and the very valuable perspectives that you shared on the report and its findings and our recommendations, I mean, I think Matthew, thanks for being here, and it's a huge job to come up with this plan. There's a lot of expectations riding on it, and inevitably not everyone will be happy with the outcome. I would say that a housing plan that delivers a little bit of something for everyone will not really deliver very much that matters. And I think like the EU has a limited toolbox to enter into this space, and it should really focus on housing as a social right, and it should take very seriously the situations where that right is being denied, and especially the most egregious violations of that right, like homelessness. We already have an EU commitment to end homelessness by 2030. We're way off the mark. It's brilliant that we've created this European momentum around the question, and I think now we need to make that more credible by having proper monitoring, supporting member states to make the kind of reforms we know they need to make, like more housing-led policies, more housing first. I think the Commission must put social housing front and centre in this plan, and I'm unfortunately not entirely convinced at this stage that that is on the cards. So I think that that is an area where we need to keep working. It was really fantastic to hear from Ben about how this looks from the perspective of somebody who has to find housing for homeless people in a major European capital city. And I think so much of what he said could be useful for informing this agenda, that you need a decent amount of social housing. You need the social housing to be cheap enough. You need it to be allocated on a needs-based way, and I thought the detail around the fast track and the points-based system was really useful, and really kind of a way of making the debates that we're having here practical and tangible. Also, I think the things that you said about workforce development, I think that's an area where the EU can probably add value if we want more evidence-based responses to homelessness in the European Union. We'll have to do a massive transformation of the workforce. So maybe that's an area where we can add value. We talked quite a lot about EU money, and I think there's, the EU budget can only go so far in the area of housing, and if we call for respect for subsidiarity, we also can't expect structural funds to fund all of EU housing policy. But I think it can make a real difference, and I think that the added value of the EU can be in doing things that aren't happening already, or supporting reforms. So like we have the Lisbon Declaration, we say we want to scale up housing first. Well, okay, how can we link the money to that? And what kind of conditions do we need to put on the money? Like, should a certain amount of the housing that is financed by the EU be reserved for the most urgent housing needs? Or yeah, I think there's a big question about conditionality. Matthew mentioned the 20 years in relation to the state aid regulation. I think 20 years, it's better than 5, that's for sure, but it's not a very long time in housing. And we have experiences from around the European Union, like in Germany, like 20 years can pass in the blink of an eye. So yeah, I think my conclusion has gone in many directions, but I really appreciated the discussion, and I hope that we've contributed to thinking about the affordable housing plan, that we have laid out clearly what we think the risks and opportunities are, and that our plea to focus this plan on housing need and not housing demand, and make sure it delivers for people rather than financial markets or the real estate sector is heard. I think more affordable housing is a good starting point, but we need a much more sophisticated answer in the next few weeks, Matthew, and then in the implementation period after that. So thanks everyone for being here. We're making the report available online, and we'd love to continue exchanging with people and discussing it in the coming period.